I've spent more years than I care to count sitting across from people who think they can look me in the eye and sell me a version of reality that doesn't exist. I spent 7 years in the Marine Corps and over a decade as a Chicago police officer before I ever stepped foot on a television stage. You don't do that kind of time without learning exactly what a lie smells like. It has a specific scent. It's the smell of desperation mixed with a total lack of accountability. When I was on the force, I saw things that would keep most people awake at night, and I learned early on that the truth is usually the simplest thing in the room, while a lie is a complicated, messy house of cards that someone is trying desperately to keep from falling over. I've reached a point in my life where my patience for that kind of nonsense is completely gone. I don't have time for the games. I don't have time for the he said, she said, and I certainly don't have time for people who try to justify the unjustifiable. I've seen it all. I've seen the career criminals, the con artists, and the cowards who hide behind a tough exterior. But nothing, and I mean nothing, gets under my skin quite like a person who fails to protect those who can't protect themselves. It's a line in the sand for me. It's the one thing I will never, ever understand, and it's the one thing I will never stop fighting against. When someone walks onto my stage and tries to tell me that they love their children while simultaneously standing by a man who treats those children like punching bags, they aren't just lying to me, they're lying to themselves, and they're betraying the most sacred bond that exists in this world. Today was one of those days that started with a weight in my chest before I even walked out from behind the curtain. I looked at the file on my desk in the production office and I saw the photos. That's usually where it starts for me. I see the evidence that the world hasn't seen yet. I saw the bruises on a 4-year-old's ribs. I saw the marks on a 6-year-old's legs that didn't come from a fall on the playground. Those marks were deliberate. They were patterned. And then I looked at the mother's statement. Her name was Sarah. She's young, but that's no excuse. In her statement, she wasn't crying out for help for her kids. She was defending Jason. Jason is the boyfriend who has been in the picture for less than 6 months. 6 months. She's known this man for half a year, and she's already willing to put his word above the safety of the human beings she brought into this world. It makes my blood boil. I sat there in my chair, staring at the monitors, watching him sit in the green room. Jason was sitting there with his arms crossed, looking defiant, like he was the victim of some grand conspiracy. Sarah was sitting next to him, leaning into him, rubbing his arm, whispering to him like they were a team against the world. It's a dynamic I've seen 1,000 times, and it never gets easier to watch. It's a sickness. It's a total breakdown of the protective instinct that should be hardwired into every parent's DNA. When I finally walked out and the camera started rolling, I didn't want to hear the pleasantries. I didn't want the setup. I wanted to get right to the heart of it. I looked at Sarah, and I saw a woman who was looking for any reason to believe a lie because the truth was too heavy for her to carry. I asked her a simple question. I asked her how she could look at those photos of her children and then look at the man sitting next to her without feeling a sense of pure, unadulterated rage. She looked at me, and her first instinct wasn't to cry for her kids. It was to defend him. She started talking about how misunderstood he is. She started talking about how he has a short fuse but a good heart. I've heard that one before. A good heart doesn't leave handprints on a toddler. A good heart doesn't scream in the face of a child who's too small to even understand why they're being punished. I told her right then and there that I didn't want to hear about his heart. I wanted to hear about her responsibility. I wanted to know where she was when the screaming started. I wanted to know why she didn't pick up her children and run the second she saw a mark that didn't belong there. Jason just sat there smirking. That's the thing about guys like him. They think they're smarter than everyone else in the room. They think if they just stay calm and act like they're being unfairly accused, people will eventually buy into it. He started talking about discipline. He used that word like it was a shield. He said he was just trying to help Sarah raise her kids because they were out of control. Out of control? They're 4 and 6 years old. They're supposed to be high energy. They're supposed to be kids. But to a guy like Jason, any behavior that inconveniences him or challenges his authority is a reason to lash out. He spoke with this cold, detached tone that I've heard from some of the most dangerous people I dealt with back in Chicago. It's the tone of a man who has zero empathy. He's not sorry for what happened. He's just annoyed that he's being questioned about it. I looked at him and I saw a bully, a coward who picks on people who are a fraction of his size because he knows they can't fight back. I told him to look at me, and when he did, I saw nothing behind his eyes but arrogance. He thought he could play me. He thought he could explain away the violence with some twisted logic about being a father figure. I told him he wasn't a father figure, he was a predator in the house, and he was the very thing those children needed to be protected from. The tension in the room was thick, the audience was silent, and you could feel the collective disgust directed at that stage. But Sarah was still there, playing the role of the loyal partner. She told me I was being too hard on him. She told me I didn't know the whole story. That's the phrase they always use, you don't know the whole story, as if there's some secret context that makes hitting a child acceptable. As if there's a chapter of the story where the bruises are actually a sign of love. I leaned in close to her and I told her that I knew exactly what I needed to know. I knew that her children were hurting, and I knew that she was choosing a man she'd known for 5 minutes over the flesh and blood she'd known for years. I asked her what she would say to her kids 20 years from now when they ask her why she let that man in her home. She didn't have an answer. She just looked down at her hands and started to cry, but even then, I wasn't sure who she was crying for. Was she crying for her babies, or was she crying because the fantasy she'd built was starting to crack under the pressure of the truth? I wasn't going to give her a pass. I wasn't going to give her a shoulder to cry on. My job isn't to make people feel better about their bad decisions. My job is to hold up a mirror and make them look at the wreckage they've caused. And right then, the wreckage was those two little kids who were probably sitting somewhere wondering why the person who's supposed to love them the most was sitting on a stage defending the person who hurt them. I've seen women like Sarah before, women who are so afraid of being alone that they'll invite a monster into their bed and call it security. She looked at me with these pleading eyes, wanting me to tell her it's okay, wanting me to validate her choice. But I won't do it. I will never do it. I looked at Jason and I saw a man who was comfortable in his own skin despite the accusations. That's a dangerous kind of person. Most people, when they're accused of something as heinous as hurting a child, have some level of physiological reaction. Their hands shake, they can't keep their eyes still, or they get defensive in a way that shows they're terrified of the truth coming out. But Jason, he just sat there with that smug half smirk, as if this was all a big joke. He actually had the nerve to tell me that the bruises on the 4-year-old's back were from roughhousing and that the boy bruises easily. I've heard that line 1,000 times. Every abuser has a medical degree when it comes to explaining away injuries. I leaned forward right into his space, and I told him that I've seen enough bruised children to know the difference between a tumble on the grass and a hand making contact with skin. A fall doesn't leave a perfect imprint of a thumb. A fall doesn't happen in places that are usually covered by a shirt. I asked him, straight up, if he hit that boy. He didn't even blink. He said no. He said he loved those kids like they were his own. That's when I turned back to Sarah, because her reaction to that lie was even more disturbing than the lie itself. She nodded. She actually nodded in agreement, as if she was proud of him for standing his ground. I had to take a breath. I had to remind myself why I do this. It's not for the ratings, and it's not for the spectacle. It's for the kids who are sitting in a house right now, terrified of the sound of a footstep in the hallway. I looked at Sarah, and I didn't see a mother. I saw an accomplice. I told her that by sitting there nodding while he lied, she was just as guilty as he was. I told her that her job, the only job that matters in this world, is to be the shield between her children and anything that wants to hurt them. Instead, she was acting like a fangirl for a man who was systematically breaking her children down. She started crying again, but this time she tried to turn it on me. She said I was being mean and that I didn't understand how hard her life has been. She started talking about her own childhood, about how she didn't have anyone, and how Jason was the first person who ever stuck by her. And that's the trap, isn't it? These guys find women who are vulnerable, women who have a hole in their lives, and they fill it with a toxic kind of attention that looks like love but feels like a cage. I told her I didn't care about her childhood right now. I cared about her children's childhood, because right now, their childhood was being defined by fear and pain, and she was the one signing off on it. Then came the moment that usually breaks the back of these lies. I had the results of the polygraph in my hand. In my years on the force, I knew that polygraphs weren't always admissible in court, but in this room, they're a mirror. They're a way to force a person to look at what they've done without any place to hide. I looked at Jason and I asked him one more time before I opened that envelope if there was anything he wanted to tell me. I gave him the chance to be a man, to own up to it, to maybe show a shred of remorse. He just stared at me. He said, "I have nothing to hide, Steve. The machine is going to show I'm telling the truth." He was so confident it almost made me second guess the file I was holding. Almost. But I've seen this brand of sociopathy before. Some people lie so often and so deeply that they actually start to believe their own bullshit. They think they can beat the machine because they've beaten every person who's ever tried to hold them accountable. I opened the envelope slowly. I wanted the silence to hang in the air. I wanted them to feel the weight of it. I looked at the results, and I wasn't surprised, but I was disgusted. I looked at Sarah first. I wanted her to see my face before I read the words. I wanted her to see the disappointment of a man who has seen too many children fail because of mothers like her. Then I looked at Jason. I told the audience, and I told the world, that when Jason was asked if he had ever intentionally caused physical injury to Sarah's children, he said no. The machine determined that was a lie. He failed, not just a little bit. He failed every significant question regarding the abuse of those kids. The reaction was immediate. Jason didn't break down and confess. He didn't put his head in his hands. He did exactly what a guilty coward does. He got angry. He stood up, started pacing the stage, and began screaming that the test was rigged. He said I was trying to set him up. He called the polygraph examiner a liar. He turned into a different person right before our eyes. The calm, misunderstood guy was gone, replaced by a snarling, aggressive man who looked like he wanted to put his fist through a wall. And Sarah, she didn't move. She sat there on that chair looking like she'd been struck by lightning. But she didn't move away from him. She didn't look at him with horror. She looked at me with anger. She actually started defending him against the results. She said the machine must be wrong because she knows him. She knows his heart. She said he was nervous and that's why he failed. I've heard every excuse in the book, but he was nervous is the one that makes me want to throw my chair across the room. You don't fail a polygraph about beating a 4-year-old because you're nervous. You fail it because you're guilty. I stood up and I got in Jason's face. I told him to sit his ass back down. I told him he wasn't going to intimidate me and he wasn't going to yell over the truth. I told him he was a child abuser. Plain and simple. I use those words because they need to be said. People like him thrive on euphemisms. They like to call it discipline or tough love. No, it's child abuse. It's a crime against the most innocent among us. He continued to rant, his face turning a deep shade of red, his veins popping out of his neck. This was the man those kids saw every day. This was the monster Sarah had invited into their home. The mask was off, and it was hideous. I turned my attention back to Sarah, and I didn't have any sympathy left. I told her to look at him. I told her to look at the man she was defending and see him for what he really is. I asked her if she really believed that a machine, a trained professional, and the bruises on her children's bodies were all lying, but this screaming, aggressive man was the only one telling the truth. She was shaking now, the reality starting to seep into the cracks of her denial, but she was still holding on. She was still trying to find a way to make it okay. It's a level of brainwashing that is hard to watch. It's what happens when a person values their relationship more than their own flesh and blood. I told her that if she walked out of that studio with him, she was just as much of a monster as he was. I told her that the state should take those kids away and never let them see her face again until she can prove she's a mother first and a girlfriend second. She started wailing then, a loud, jarring sound that echoed through the studio. It wasn't the sound of a mother grieving for her children's pain. It was the sound of a woman losing her grip on the lie that kept her world together. Jason was still trying to play the tough guy, telling me I couldn't talk to her like that. I told him I'd talk to her however I wanted because I was the only one in the room actually looking out for her kids. I told him he was nothing. He was a small, pathetic man who felt big by hurting people smaller than him. I told the security to get him off my stage. I didn't want him in my sight for another second. I wanted him gone, out in the street where he belonged, away from those children. As they led him away, he was still swearing, still claiming he was innocent, still trying to maintain the charade. But the charade was over. The truth was out there now, and it wasn't going back into the box. I stayed on the stage with Sarah, and for a moment, the room was silent. Just the sound of her heavy breathing and the distant sound of Jason being escorted out. I sat down next to her, not because I wanted to comfort her, but because I wanted her to hear me. I wanted her to listen to the truth without the distraction of his presence. I told her that this was the crossroads of her life. She could choose him or she could choose her children, but she couldn't have both. Not on my watch, and not if there was any justice left in the world. I sat there on the edge of the stage, the heavy silence of the studio pressing in on us. Jason was gone, his echoing shouts fading out in the hallway as security hauled him toward the exit. But his shadow was still all over Sarah. She was hunched over, her hair covering her face, her shoulders shaking with these deep, jagged sobs. I've seen this 1,000 times. It's the sound of a person who just watched their house of cards catch fire and realized they're standing in the middle of it. But I wasn't there to hold her hand. I wasn't there to tell her it was going to be okay. Because the truth is, for her children, it hasn't been okay for a long time. I looked at her and I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who had abdicated her most basic human responsibility. I've spent years in the dark corners of Chicago pulling kids out of situations that would make your stomach turn. And the one thing that always haunts me isn't the guy with the belt or the fist. It's the woman standing in the kitchen who heard the screams and did nothing. That's the person I can't get past. I leaned in, making sure she had to look at me. I told her to pull herself together because her tears were a luxury her children didn't have. When they were being terrorized by that man, they didn't have the luxury of sitting down and having a cry. They had to survive. They had to figure out how to navigate the minefield of her relationship just to get through the day. I asked her point blank what those kids did to deserve this. I asked her what a 4-year-old could possibly do that warranted a man's hand leaving a mark on his body. She didn't have an answer. She just kept saying she didn't know it was that bad. That's the lie they used to sleep at night. I didn't know, but she did know. You don't live in a house with a man like Jason and not know. You see the flinch when he moves his hand too fast. You see the way the kids go quiet when his car pulls into the driveway. You see the bruises, and you choose to look at the wall instead of the skin. You know, you just decide that your need for a boyfriend is more important than your children's need for a protector. I told her about a call I went on years ago when I was still in uniform. It was a cold winter night, and we got a call for a domestic disturbance. When we got there, the mother was sitting on the couch, her face bruised, her lips split. She was crying about how much she loved the guy. I went into the back bedroom and found 2 little girls hiding under a bed. They weren't crying. They were silent. That's the part that stays with you, the silence of a child who has learned that making noise only brings more pain. I remember looking at that mother and thinking, how did you let it get to this point? Sarah was that mother. She was sitting on my stage trying to convince me that Jason was a good guy who just lost his temper. I told her that a man who loses his temper on a child is a coward. A man who uses his strength to dominate someone who weighs 40 pounds is the lowest form of life on this planet, and a woman who allows it is his silent partner. I didn't hold back. I told her that she was failing. I used that word intentionally because it's a heavy word. It's a word that should hurt. I told her she was failing the one job she was given in this life. I told her that those children were a gift, and she was treating them like they were secondary to her social life. I told her that if she stayed with him, if she even took one phone call from him after today, she was telling her kids that they didn't matter. I told her that the state was going to be watching her now. I told her that I was going to make sure the right people saw the tapes of this show and the results of that polygraph. I wanted her to feel the weight of the consequences. I wanted her to understand that this wasn't just a TV show, this was a turning point for the lives of 2 innocent human beings. She started to argue back, her voice thin and desperate. She said I was being judgmental and that I didn't know what it was like to be alone. I lost it then. I stood up and I told her that I don't care about her being alone. I'd rather she be alone for the rest of her life than have those kids spend one more night in a house with a man who hits them. I told her that being a parent is about sacrifice. It's about putting your needs, your fears, and your loneliness at the very bottom of the list so that your children can be at the top. If she couldn't do that, she shouldn't have kids. It's that simple. There is no middle ground when it comes to the safety of a child. You're either protecting them or you're part of the problem. The audience was completely still. I could see people in the front row shaking their heads. There was this collective sense of enough is enough. I turned back to Sarah and I gave her the ultimatum. I told her that we had a place for her to go, we had resources, we had people who could help her get away, help her get her life together, and help her learn how to be the mother those kids deserved. But the condition was that Jason had to be dead to her. No more giving him another chance. No more hearing his side of the story. He was a child abuser, and there was no other side to that story. I told her if she didn't take the help, then she was choosing the monster. And if she chose the monster, she was going to lose those kids. She sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the floor. The reality was finally hitting her. The boyfriend she'd been defending was gone, exposed as a liar and a bully. The life she'd been trying to preserve was in pieces. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the old habits of denial, fighting against the raw truth I just laid out. I didn't push her. I let the silence do the work. I let her sit in the wreckage of her decisions. I wanted her to feel the coldness of that stage. I wanted her to understand that she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the only thing that could save her was a total and complete rejection of the man she claimed to love. Finally, she looked up. Her eyes were red, her face was puffy, and for the first time, she looked like she was actually seeing me. Not just a TV host, but the man who was telling her the truth she'd been running from. She whispered that she wanted the help. She said she was scared, but she knew she couldn't go back. I didn't applaud. I didn't give her a hug. I just nodded. I told her that saying it was the easy part. Doing it was going to be the hardest thing she'd ever done. I told her that she was going to have to look her kids in the eye and apologize to them every single day for the rest of her life for what she allowed to happen. I told her that trust isn't given, it's earned, and she had a lot of earning to do. I signaled for my producers to come out and take her backstage. I wanted her out of the spotlight so she could start the real work. As she walked off, she looked small, broken, but for the first time since she stepped on that stage, she looked like she might actually have a chance to do the right thing. I watched her go, and then I turned back to the audience. I didn't have a script. I didn't have a prepared closing. I just looked at the people in the room and I told them that we have to do better. We have to be the voice for the kids who can't speak for themselves. We have to stop making excuses for discipline that's actually violence. We have to stop prioritizing our own desires over the safety of our children. I walked back to my chair and sat down for a second after the camera stopped. The studio lights were still hot. The air was still thick with the residue of the confrontation. I thought about those kids. I thought about the bruises on that 4-year-old's ribs. I hope to God that today was the last day they ever felt a hand raised in anger against them. I hope that Sarah's choice would stick when the cameras were off and the reality of being alone set in. Because at the end of the day, I can provide the stage, I can provide the polygraph, and I can provide the truth, but I can't provide the spine. That has to come from her. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes, the weight of the day settling into my bones. People think this is just television. They think it's just a show. But for those kids, this was the difference between a life of fear and a chance at peace. And that's why I don't apologize for being mean. That's why I don't apologize for the yelling. Because someone has to be the storm that blows the lies away. I walked back to my dressing room, but I couldn't sit down. My mind was still back there on that stage, still looking at the empty seat where Jason had been sitting and the broken woman who had been occupying the one next to it. I've been doing this for a long time, and people always ask me how I stay so angry. They ask me why I don't just mellow out or take it easy. But how can you take it easy when you know there are kids out there who are living in a nightmare? I walked over to the small monitor in the corner of my room. It was still showing the feed from the hallway. I saw Sarah sitting on a bench, her head in her hands, a female producer standing nearby with a bottle of water. Sarah looked like she'd aged 10 years in the last hour. Good. She should feel the weight of it. She should feel every bit of the exhaustion that her children feel every single day they have to navigate a world where they aren't safe in their own skin. I've always said that I'm not a judge and I'm not a jury. I don't wear a robe and I don't carry a gavel. But I do have a voice, and I have a platform, and I have a set of eyes that have seen too much to ever look away again. When I sat there and told her she was failing, I wasn't saying it to be cruel. I was saying it because it's the objective truth. Morality isn't a gray area when it comes to the abuse of a child. It's the clearest right and wrong we have in a society. If you hit a child, you are wrong. If you see someone hit a child and you don't stop it, you are wrong. There is no nuance there. There is no context that changes the moral geometry of that situation. Jason is a predator, plain and simple. He's a man who found a woman with low self-esteem and used her home as his hunting ground. He used her children as objects to exert his power. And Sarah, whether she wants to admit it or not, was the person who opened the door and let him in. I think about the concept of responsibility a lot. We live in a world where everyone wants to be the victim. Everyone has a reason why they did what they did, a trauma they can point to, an excuse they can lean on. Sarah wanted to talk about her past, about her loneliness, about how Jason stuck by her. But what about the kids? Who is sticking by them? They don't have a past to blame. They only have a present, and their present was being dictated by a man who shouldn't have been allowed within 100 miles of them. I've seen this pattern so many times, it's sickening. The boyfriend moves in, the abuse starts small, a pop on the arm, a stern talking to, and then it escalates because the mother doesn't set a hard line. She's so afraid of losing the man that she sacrifices the children. It's a betrayal of the highest order. It's the ultimate moral failure. I've had people tell me that I'm too hard on the mothers. They say these women are often victims of domestic violence themselves. And look, I've seen that too. I've seen women who are terrified for their own lives. But even then, there is a moment where you have to decide. There is a moment where the survival of your offspring has to outweigh your own fear. If you can't protect them, you have to get them to someone who can. You don't just sit there and watch the bruises multiply. You don't just hope it gets better. Hope isn't a plan. Hope doesn't heal a broken rib. I remember a guy I arrested back in Chicago. He'd beaten his girlfriend's son so badly the kid ended up in the ICU. When I sat him down in an interrogation room, he gave me the same exact lines Jason gave me today. He wouldn't listen. I was just trying to be a father. I didn't mean to hurt him. I remember looking at that guy and realizing that he didn't even see the child as a human being. He saw him as an obstacle. And the mother, she was in the waiting room at the hospital, still trying to figure out how to get him out on bail. That's a level of sickness that I will never be able to wrap my head around. It's a total collapse of the moral compass. As I stood in my dressing room, I realized that the fight for those kids is just beginning. Getting Jason off the stage was the easy part. Getting him out of their lives for good is much harder. That's why I told Sarah that the state would be watching. I want her to be afraid. I want her to know that there are eyes on her now. Sometimes fear is the only thing that keeps people like her in line. If she won't protect them out of love, maybe she'll do it out of fear of going to jail or losing her kids forever. It's a sad state of affairs when it comes to that, but that's the reality of the world we live in. I walked over to the window and looked out at the street. People were walking by, going about their day, totally unaware of the drama that had just unfolded inside these walls. But inside, everything felt different. The air was heavy. There was a sense of lingering anger that usually takes hours to dissipate. My producers came in to go over the next segment, but I told them to give me 5 minutes. I needed to just breathe. I needed to wash the Jason off me. You can't stand that close to that kind of evil without some of it sticking to you. It's a greasy, dirty feeling. I thought about the victims again, those 2 little boys. I wondered what they were doing right at that moment. I wondered if they knew that for the first time in their lives, someone had stood up and said their names and told the world that what was happening to them was a crime. I hope someone tells them. I hope they find out that the man who hurt them was called out for being the coward he is. They need to know that they didn't do anything wrong. They need to know that the discipline they received wasn't because they were bad kids, but because they were living with a bad man. Sarah's defense of him is something I'll be chewing on for a long time. It's the why that always gets me. Why him? Why this guy who brings nothing to the table but pain? Is the fear of being alone so great that you'd rather see your children suffer? It's a question that haunts this entire show. It's the question that sits at the center of every one of these cases. I don't have the answer. I just have the reaction. And my reaction is to keep pushing, keep yelling, and keep holding people accountable until they have no choice but to see the truth.